The Forest of Time. A Temporal Protection Corps story. By E. W. Barnes. Digital voice narration. For A.B. with Love. Chapter 6. Richard leapt out of the bed. He'd been sleeping for hours, and it was after midnight. Rose's bed was empty. He didn't have far to go. The screaming was coming from Tanima's room, and Rose was already there. She was struggling with Tanima. "What's going on?" Richard yelled as he pulled Rose away. "I don't know," Rose shouted as Tanima continued to scream. "Help me stop her from hurting herself," Rose said as she wrenched away from Richard. Tanima was pulling her own hair and clawing at her face. Rose grabbed Tanima's hands, clasping them as she writhed. "They're coming. They're coming," Tanima howled. "Who's coming?" Richard asked, but the answer was more screaming. "We need a sedative," Rose growled. "Medical supplies are in the kitchen." "I'll hold her. You get the sedative." "Be right back," Rose said as she brushed her hair out of her face and hurried from the room. Richard eased behind Tanima on the bed. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her wrists, and hugged her against his chest. She thrashed and bucked but could not break free. "It's all right. I've got you. You're safe," he murmured over and over, like a mantra, trying to get her to relax. Rose returned with a subcutaneous injector. With a soft whoosh, the medicine released under her skin and Tanima relaxed in his arms. He gently laid her back on the bed. "What was that all about?" he asked, scratching his head. "I don't know," Rose said. "I'd fallen asleep in the computer room and woke up to Dr. Nilsson's screaming. When I came into the room, it was as if she couldn't see me or didn't recognize me. Then she began hurting herself. I tried to stop her, and that's when you came in." "How long will she be out?" Rose sighed. "A few hours, I think." "They're coming," she said, Richard repeated. "Maybe we should check the security monitors." There was nothing out of the ordinary on the outside monitors, however. A few nocturnal animals registered on the infrared, but everything was quiet, peaceful even. Rose looked up at him. "Want to get a cup of coffee?" "I'll take tea," he said with a smile. They sat in the kitchen, steaming cups in front of them. For a few minutes there was silence between them as they sipped, each in their own thoughts. But Richard knew the look on Rose's face. "Dr. Lamone's disappearance and Tanima's fit, or whatever it was, you think they're related?" "Yes, I do. Don't you?" He sighed. "We have two scientists with outstanding records, suddenly behaving irrationally within 24 hours of each other. You're right, it's not a coincidence." "Things started going wrong when they took the gel," Rose said. "When Dr. Lamone took the gel," Richard corrected. "Tanima said the gel was some kind of toxin. Could they have been exposed to it?" "That seems probable," Rose said. "If he, broke protocol by collecting the gel, he may have also broken protocol in handling it. She picked up the container yesterday, remember? That's how she got exposed. But what's it doing to them?" "Hallucinations, paranoia, violent behavior. You saw Dr. Nilsson," Rose shrugged. "Which means Dr. Lamone may not want to be found," he said. Rose cocked her head at him. "Great," Richard said. He pushed his tea away and leaned back in the chair with his arms crossed. "Just great." They took turns sitting with Tanima, one in the chair in her room, the other dozing in a bunk in the guest quarters. The image of dawn projected through the monitor window was warming the room when Tanima opened her eyes and moaned. Richard stood, ready to restrain her again if needed. "Where am I?" "You're in your room," he answered. "But where am I?" "John base, remember?" "The base, right, the base. I know you. You're the nice one." "Right," he said, edging toward the door. Rose. She's awake, he called out in a loud whisper. How are you feeling? He asked as he turned back to Tanima. I feel sleepy, she answered. Confused. Hungry. Scared. I'm scared. Why do I feel so scared? She looked at Richard, her eyes enormous. Everything's all right, he said in a soothing voice. There's nothing to be afraid of. How are you feeling? Rose asked as she walked in. Oh, it's the mean one, Tanima replied sleepily, closing her eyes. She says she's hungry, confused and scared, Richard replied quickly. Tanima sat up, gripping Richard's arm. They're coming, she whispered. I have to hide. They're coming. No one's coming, Rose answered. You're safe. We will protect you. You will? Tanima asked in a voice like a child. Yes, we will, Rose said. You can rest. Okay, Tanima nodded. She rolled over and was soon fast asleep again. Richard followed Rose out of the room and into the kitchen. I think it's clear she can't take part in the search for Dr. Limon today, Rose said, frowning. I agree, Richard nodded. Mission protocol requires we go out in pairs. I don't think we can leave Tanima alone. Rose sighed and sat in a chair. You're right. She ran her fingers through her hair. We need to request backup from the TPC. I'll do it, Richard said. You get something to eat. Once I contact the TPC, backup should arrive almost immediately. Rose was finishing a piece of toast with jam when Richard returned. She took one look at his face and stopped eating. What's wrong? Did something happen to Tanima? She called her Tanima instead of Dr. Nilsson, he thought in passing. That's a good sign. But there was no time to marvel at Rose's softened stance. I can't contact the TPC, he said. Why not? Rose said, standing. I don't know. The equipment is working. The diagnostics all come back within established parameters. Our message is transmitting through time, but there's no response. Protocol requires that one of us shift back to alert the TPC about this malfunction, Rose said. I know, Richard said, nodding. I'll go. No, stay here. Dr. Nilsson. Tanima trusts you. You're the nice one, remember? Rose said with a wry smile. If all goes well, I'll only be gone for a few minutes. Richard followed her to the computer room. Rose tapped the control panel of the temporal amplifier, setting the coordinates for Temporal Protection Corps headquarters in the year 2189. She activated the device and Richard waited for the telltale blue of a shift to the future, but nothing happened. We have a bigger problem than we thought, she said. One of us must continue the search for Dr. Limon, Richard said. Even if it means violating protocol. We're cut off from the TPC and on our own. This is no longer about strictly following the rules. This is about saving a human life. I know, Rose said. She'd been staring at unhelpful computer reports for several minutes, and she looked up at Richard, nodding. I know, she said again. And that's what we'll do. With one last withering look at the useless temporal amplifier diagnostics on the screen, she pulled up the map and search grid they'd showed Tanima. You and Dr. Nilsson covered segments 1 and 2 yesterday, she said, pointing to the pie-piece-shaped lines extending from the airlock's location on the map. I think I should search 15 and 16. What makes you say that? Just a hunch, she said. If Dr. Limon is experiencing paranoia and hallucinations like Dr. Nilsson, he may not have traveled far. He may be closer to the base than we guessed, hiding from us. It's your call, Your Majesty, Richard replied with a wink, and was gratified to see a grudging smile in return. 15 minutes later, Rose stepped out of the airlock, moving with purposeful strides through the horsetail grass. Every 10 minutes, she reported her status to Richard, who in return reported that Tanima continued to improve. She didn't stop to marvel at the wonders and beauty of Laurasia in the Cretaceous period. No statuesque cycad caught her attention, no delighted observation of Yomaya or Chongchungornis interrupted her search. She concentrated on every nook and cranny that could hide an adult man, trying to ignore the one thought that would break her heart. I'm trapped 125 million years in the past. I might never see Kevin again. Chapter 7. A rustling sound startled him awake. He was lying on the ground, cold and damp. Where am I? He lay still, not opening his eyes, listening to his other senses to answer his question. Judging by the soft swishing of leaves and the rich smell of conifers, decomposing leaves and fresh earth, he was in a forest. Had he been hiking, Yosemite maybe, or Taman Nagara, and camped in the open? His body felt sore, maybe that was it. But his head hurt too, and his thoughts were sluggish. Had he fallen? If he'd hit his head, suffered a concussion, that would explain a lot. He rolled over, keeping his eyes closed to let them adjust slowly to the light. That's what you were supposed to do for concussions, right? Twigs crackled under him as he got on his hands and knees. He opened his eyes. Familiar fans of golden brown spread beneath his fingers. Ginkgo leaves? He was not in Yosemite or Taman Nagara. He looked up, squinting and wincing, and then groaned in recognition, pulling his hands away from the earth and tucking them under his arms. He was outside the base without his biosuit, every touch, every breath contaminating the Cretaceous environment. He looked around wildly. Nothing was familiar. He didn't know where he was or how to get back to the base. How did this happen? How did he get here? There was a tight feeling in his chest. He stood suddenly, breathing fast and sharp. He had to get out of here. He had to get away. He turned to run, rearing back as a tree branch loomed in front of him. He touched his forehead where the bruise was. He remembered hitting the branch, the white flash of pain. Shaking and wishing he had something to eat, he sat on the ground with his back against the tree trunk. Tanima would look for him. The best thing to do was to stay in place and wait. Rose drank from the spout positioned at her neck. The day had grown warm, much warmer than the day before. Even though the biosuit had its own environmental controls, she felt itchy. How are you doing, Rose? Richard asked. Right on time, Rose thought. Nothing to report yet, she answered. I'm nearing the top of Section 16, readying to cross over into Section 15. No sign of Dr. Lamond. You may have to return sooner than planned, Richard replied. It looks like a summer storm is forming. Tanima says the storms can bring hail, lightning strikes, and flash flooding. Rose exhaled, looking over her shoulder at the cumulonimbus clouds climbing into the sky in the distance. This was turning into the mission from hell. How long do I have? There was a pause, then. Tanima estimates another 2 hours. Very well, Rose said, cutting off communications. She activated the heads-up display and input a new search pattern to cover the most ground and returned to the base in 2 hours. If it was all the time she had, she would use every minute. Richard and Tanima sat in the computer room watching the video feed from Rose's biosuit. Tanima was wrapped in a blanket, sipping warm broth. Are you feeling better? Richard asked as Tanima shifted in her chair. Yes. And no, she answered before taking another sip. What do you mean? I'm still feeling a little foggy. She tucked her legs up under her. Mostly, I'm feeling embarrassed. Why? Richard turned from the computer to look at her. Tanima shrugged. Richard shook his head. There's no need to feel embarrassed. Things happen, he said as he turned back to the computer. How long have you been with the TPC? 5 years, Tanima said. How about you? A little over 10 years, Richard answered, meeting her eyes for a moment before looking back at the video feed. You agents start out as chronohistorians, don't you? Yeah, he nodded. What was your area of expertise? The 19th century, Richard. The study of astronomy in that era is fascinating. What about you? He said, turning to look at her again. Her eyes were such a beautiful brown. What's so fascinating about photosynthesis in the Cretaceous period? Tanima adjusted her blanket. If we can better understand how photosynthesis evolved over the millennia, we might be able to replicate it. He looked at her blankly. You know food from sunlight? She laughed as his eyes grew large as he realized the implications. And Dr. Lamond? Was his research as equally groundbreaking? Tanima nodded. He's helping to develop an adaptive viral vaccine. She looked down. He lost family in the pandemic of 2175. He wants to make sure no one ever has to go through what he did again. The video feed showed Rose approaching a copse of conifers deep with shadows. It might make a good hiding place, Richard thought. He keyed his microphone. This looks promising, he said to Rose. Affirmative, Rose replied. Tanima stood up, the cup of broth and blanket falling to the floor. She has to get out of there. Her voice was shaking. It's coming. Richard took her hands in his. Nothing's coming. Everything is okay. No. Look. She pulled her hand away and pointed to the screen. Rose had stopped moving, turning her head slowly. The picture was shaking rhythmically, like a heartbeat. Agent Kern, are you reading any seismic activity in the area? Rose asked. Negative, Richard replied. It's not an earthquake, Tanima hissed. She's got to get out of there. Richard turned to face her again. What is it? Uranus. The shadows under the trees were dark enough to hide a man. Rose entered the copse, looking for a heat signature movement, anything to suggest Dr. Lamond was there. But the only thing that registered was the trembling of the ground beneath her feet. Ah, Rose, Tanima says you need to vacate the area immediately, Richard said. Rose froze. Why? She asked, but she already knew the answer. A heat signature appeared on her heads-up display. It was enormous and getting closer. If it stayed on the same course, its trajectory would take it past the copse, but not through it. She stepped behind a trunk, hiding in the shadows. She peered out as it came through the trees. Over 9 meters long, it towered over her. Like the Bapiosaurus, it was feathered, and like the Altarinus, it had a distinctive snout with a flash of color along a high central crest. But that's where the similarities ended. Everything about it said predator. It stopped within feet of her, its huge head swinging. Rose felt the stirrings of panic, the zinging primal fear of the hunted. She took deep breaths. Rose, your heart rate is increasing. Are you okay? She didn't answer. She didn't know if it hunted by sight, sound, or smell, and she didn't want to find out. Tanima calls it a Uranus. It's the apex predator in this environment. Richard's voice was low, as if he too did not want to be overheard. I can believe that, Rose whispered. What do I do? The Uranus raised its head and roared. Rose flinched. Tanima says not to move. Rose nodded, even though Richard could not see her acknowledgement of the advice. The Uranus swung its head again, raising it to the air and then to the forest floor. It was moving steadily before, Rose thought. Why did it stop now? That it sensed she was there was something Rose did not want to consider. The beast roared again, and as it did, Rose registered new movement on the display. Another heat signature. It was moving fast toward her position. By the size of it, it was a second Uranus. The question now was how to get out of the area without either animal seeing her. When the second dinosaur emerged from the forest at a run, The clash was shocking. She knew she would never forget the roars of challenge, and the thunder of their feet hitting the ground as they swayed and turned, breaking tree branches and crushing Horsetail. Rose stifled a cry as the tree she was hiding behind lurched toward her. One of the dinosaurs had fallen onto it, pushing it out of the ground into the thick copse. She spun as it fell, pain blooming across her back. The backpack containing Dr. Lamone's biosuit took most of the impact, but the force was jarring. The tree stood now at an impossible angle. She ducked further into the copse as another tree repelled a falling dinosaur, with a loss of several branches. She was being driven in the wrong direction, she realized. Rose breathlessly programmed the heads-up display for a route that would take her around the battle. "There are two of them," she muttered into her microphone, even though Richard and Tanima could see everything she saw. "I'm trying to find a way around." Keeping her movements to a minimum, she darted from one shadow to another each time the Uranus faced away from her, as they squared off. She was 30 meters from the battle and starting to breathe easier when a hand grabbed her leg. Rose screamed. The sound echoed in her biosuit helmet as she staggered away. Dr. Lamond was sitting on the ground, his back to a tree. He held his finger up to his mouth as he craned his head around toward the battle. Then he stared at her. "Tanima," he mouthed. Rose shook her head. "Is she okay?" "Yes," Rose nodded as she mouthed the word. "Are you here to help me?" Rose nodded again. Dr. Lamond looked as though he might weep. He stood, leaning against the tree as if his legs would not hold his weight. He would need help to walk. Rose looked back toward the battle. Would it be better to wait here until it was over, or risk being spotted if Dr. Lamond stumbled or fell? Dr. Lamond appeared to understand her conundrum. He jerked his head towards the raging dinosaurs. "We can't stay," he mouthed. She pointed to the backpack and then her suit, to tell him she had his biosuit with her. "Later," he mouthed. "We have to leave the area." She put her arm around him to support him. Slowly, they moved away from the fighting Uranus, following the new route back to the base. They could no longer see the dinosaurs through the trees. The sounds of the battle diminished, but Rose could still feel the rumbling vibrations under her feet. They stayed in the thickest parts of the forest, keeping to the shadows of the trees. Rose was grateful for the cover. "Richard, this is Rose. Come in," she transmitted as she leaned the scientist against a tree so he could regain his balance. He was sipping water and nibbling on a protein snack she'd given him. "Richard here. How's it going?" "I found Dr. Lamond, as you know. He's ambulatory for the most part, but he needs help and frequent rests." Rose guessed his shakiness could have been from being outside for 36 hours or the effects of the gel. It didn't matter. "His difficulties are slowing us down," she said with her face away from him so he could not read her lips. "I estimate we're still 45 minutes from the base." "What's the status of the storm?" she asked as she looked up. She could barely see the sky through the canopy of conifer branches. "Unchanged," Richard answered. "You'll probably get a little wet before you make it to the airlock." "Understood," Rose said. "Sprucewood out." She moved in front of Dr. Lamond until he could see her face. "Ready?" He nodded. She pointed to the sky and then made downward motions with her fingers to suggest rain. He nodded again and pushed himself away from the tree, declining her help as he trudged on. Ahead, the conifers thinned. Certain they had moved far enough away from the Uranus battle, Rose made for the open space, hoping they could move more quickly there. Here the trees were primarily ginkgos and cycads, which let in more light than the conifers. What little light there was. Now that she could see the boiling sky, she knew they would get more than a little wet before they made it back to the base. She stopped and unslung the backpack. It was scraped and scarred from the impact of the tree. Dr. Lamond took his biosuit, grimacing as he put it on over his soiled clothes. As he fastened the biosuit closed, Rose pulled his helmet from the backpack, but it felt wrong. It was halfway out of the pack when she saw the problem. The faceplate was cracked, and small pieces of shattered biopolymer threatened to drop to the forest floor. She lowered the helmet back into the pack before any pieces fell to the ground and looked up at Dr. Lamond. He stared at it and then shrugged. "It can't be helped. We need to keep moving," he mouthed, pointing to the sky. She returned the pack to her back. As they wove their way around the cycads and ginkgo trunks, she thought about radioing an update about the helmet to Richard, but the video feed had told them all they needed to know. 10 minutes later, the atmospheric pressure readout on her heads-up display flashed a warning. At the same time, Dr. Lamond stopped. He pointed to the ginkgos, fan-shaped leaves fluttering endlessly. The sky had turned greenish, and out of the corner of her eye she saw a flash. The wind rose and fluttering fans of ginkgo leaves dropped to the ground as strong gusts threw branches. Rose increased her pace, Dr. Lamond at her side. "Come on," she shouted, even though Dr. Lamond could not hear her. There was a thunk on top of her helmet. Small pellets bounced on the ground. "Richard," she called on the radio, as she and Dr. Lamond continued to jog forward. "We're seeing hail. Anything else we need to worry about?" "Check, see hail, lightning, don't." "Tornadoes." Hissing punctuated the garbled transmission, and static crackled with each flash of lightning. She felt the thunder in her feet. "Richard, please repeat your last." There was only static in response. "John Base, please come in." Still nothing. "Damn," Rose muttered. Dr. Lamond grabbed her arm, alarm etched on his face. He pointed to the west. Rose expected to see a funnel cloud rising. It took her a moment to register that what she was seeing was not a tornado, but smoke blowing toward them. A lightning strike had started a fire. A wildfire. She didn't know how fast wildfires moved, but she was sure it was faster than 2 humans could run. Chapter 8. Dr. Lamond could only move at a jogging pace, and Rose refused to let him fall behind. She stayed at his side and pointed the direction they needed to go, guided by the base beacon. Every 100 meters, she tried the radio again. After 30 minutes of jogging, Dr. Lamond was stumbling and weaving. Despite the danger, he needed to rest. She touched his arm and gestured to a tree to protect them from the intermittent hail. He nodded and leaned against the trunk, drinking the last of the water. She knew it was risky to stand under a tree in a thunderstorm, but it was a necessary risk. There were taller trees to invite lightning, she tried to convince herself. Still, as soon as Dr. Lamond's color returned and the hail had stopped for the moment, she insisted they keep moving. "Just a few more minutes," she said, holding up 5 fingers 3 times to be sure he understood, and pointing in the direction of the beacon. Except the beacon wasn't there. She reinitialized the system. There was no signal from the beacon. No, wait, there it was, blinking. Then it was gone again. Rose swore, using words that were definitely not by the book. The electrical discharges from the lightning were interfering with the beacon's signal. Or maybe it was the fire. She knew wildfires could generate their own storm fronts when they grew large enough. She didn't want to think about what large enough meant. While she knew the general direction, they needed the beacon to pinpoint the airlock's exact location. Without it, they could wander the area for hours and never find it. And there was no time to wander. But even if they couldn't find the airlock, they had to keep going. Standing still was not an option. If they were lucky, when they got close enough to the base, communications might be restored, and they could figure something out with Richard and Tanima. "This way," Rose said to Dr. Lamond. This time she took the lead, turning frequently to ensure he kept up. He seemed to sense her unease. He was right behind her every time she checked, a worried frown on his face. Every so often, the beacon's signal lit up on her display, and then disappeared. It was enough to confirm she was heading in the right direction. Movement off to her left startled her. More hail. The heads-up display flashed the name of an animal, but she barely saw it. It ran ahead of them and disappeared into the forest. A different name flashed as another small animal sprinted past. Then another. They were running from the fire, Rose realized. She risked a glance back and gasped. The fire was gaining on them, a wall of smoke billowing ahead of it. "Where's the damned airlock?" Rose rasped. She tried the radio again. "John Base, come in. This is Agent Sprucewood. Richard, are you reading?" All she heard was static. A strong gust of wind pushed her from behind, and with it came swirls of smoke. Rose looked back at Dr. Lamond. He'd fallen behind, and as she identified his silhouette in the thickening smoke, he was racked by coughing. She grabbed his hand, partly guiding him, partly pulling him. Larger animals were running past now, shadows looming in the smoke before veering off. On top of everything else, they faced the risk of being run over or attacked by the prehistoric giants of the forest. Their pace slowed. Rose couldn't see trees and other obstacles until they appeared in front of her. She could feel Dr. Lamond's hand jerking in hers every time he coughed. Where was the airlock? They were close, she knew, but without the beacon. "Richard, this is Rose. Can you read me?" There was no answer, but Rose had not expected one. She reinitialized the beacon. If she could get one blip from it, just enough to tell her how close they were, perhaps they could find the airlock by feel. A red light gleamed ahead. Cold settled into Rose's stomach. The fire was ahead of them. They had run out of time. But the light didn't flicker and pulse as fire did. It was steady, fading only as smoke obscured it, and then shining strong again in clearer air. "Come on," Rose said, squeezing Dr. Lamond's hand. She expected the light to get larger as she approached, but it didn't, and it wasn't until she walked into an invisible wall that she realized the light was coming from one of the airlock's hologram lenses. Richard and Tanima had reprogrammed the hologram so Rose could find it. The red light was a small dot against the illusion of the forest. Rose and Dr. Lamond ran their hands along the sides of the airlock, trying to find the entrance. The hologram mirrored smoke and ash, and was so disorienting it was easier to close her eyes and see with her hands. Her fingers found an edge. The door. With a sigh of relief, she ushered Dr. Lamond in ahead of her. Dr. Lamond moved to the wall panel. He needed to key the system for manual activation so that air evacuation wouldn't occur automatically when Rose closed the door. Without his helmet, he would die in the vacuum created by the system otherwise. Rose pulled on the handle, taking one last look outside. She saw someone. A dark human figure in the smoke. Did Richard or Tanima come outside to reprogram the hologram? She held the door open, uncertain. A sudden blow knocked her to the floor. An animal escaping the fire had run into the airlock. Psittacosaurus, juvenile, her heads-up display identified it, not that the information was helpful to Rose. Discovering it was trapped, it slammed into the walls, its eyes wide and terrified. Dr. Lamond moved carefully to the back of the airlock, raising his arms to look as large as possible. Rose scrambled to join him, and together they crept forward, herding the frightened animal toward the outer door. A meter from the opening, the Psittacosaurus appeared to understand what they were doing. It turned and leapt out, disappearing into the gloom. As she swung the door closed, Rose saw flames climbing trees in the distance. Dr. Lamond leaned against the wall, breathing hard. Until they initiated the air exchange cycle, the airlock would remain smoky, but the heavier ash blown in with them drifted to the floor. After a moment, Dr. Lamond pushed himself away from the wall and opened a cabinet, pulling out a spare biosuit helmet. "Rose, this is Richard. Are you okay?" Rose jumped at the sound. "Yes, we're fine," she answered, her heart racing. "We're in the airlock." Dr. Lamond is putting on a helmet so we can start the air exchange cycle. Thank goodness, Richard sounded weak with relief. Good idea reprogramming the hologram, Rose said. We lost the signal from the beacon, and I don't think we would have found the airlock without your help. That was Tanima's idea, Richard said. When we lost comm, we guessed the interference might mess with the beacon's signal. We knew you were close enough to risk it. It was a good idea. It probably saved our lives, Rose said. Initiating the air exchange. Stand by, Dr. Lamond said, tapping the screen on the wall. The vents opened and the smoke cleared. Rose felt her biosuit expand to compensate as the airlock exchanged the atmosphere for vacuum. A wall screen flashed red. We have a problem, Dr. Lamond said. He was tapping the screen on the wall, which continued to flash red. What's going on? Rose asked. I can't repressurize the airlock, he answered. According to the schematics, there's a manual control behind the panel by your feet, Richard said. Dr. Lamond had already dropped to the floor, opening a wall panel dented by the Psittacosaurus and toggling the switch. From the drop of his head, Rose assumed it hadn't worked. What do we do now? We have to figure out why the mechanism isn't working, Dr. Lamond said. Tanima, are you getting any readings from the schematics display? There was a pause before Tanima responded. Rose assumed it was because she was putting on a headset. Shang, the display says the problem is the switch itself. It's physically stuck. So we can just unstick it, right? Rose asked. I have to see it, but yes, I should be able to fix it, Dr. Lamond answered. Tanima, what's the status of the fire? It's getting closer, Shang. You don't have much time. What does she mean we don't have much time? Dr. Lamond removed another damaged panel and looked up at her. The airlock isn't designed to withstand fire. If we can't repressurize and engage the elevator mechanism to lower us into the base, we'll die in here. Can't we engage the elevator and fix the switch after we're out of the fire's path? It doesn't work that way, Dr. Nilsson answered. There's a fail-safe that won't engage the elevator mechanism until it completes the air exchange. Designed to prevent accidental contamination. Of course, Rose rolled her eyes. And we can't override it, Dr. Lamond nodded. How long do we have, Tanima? At the rate the fire is moving, 30 minutes at most. Can you fix the mechanism before then? Dr. Lamond reached a hand into the wall where he'd removed the panel. Rose held her breath. I don't think so, he finally answered. It looks like it was damaged when the Psittacosaurus ran in. I can fix it, but it will take longer than 30 minutes. What are we going to do? Rose asked, flutterings of panic in her chest. We're right in the fire's path. Change its path. Richard exclaimed. What? Rose asked, but Dr. Lamond muttered yes and opened another panel. You need to build a fire break around the airlock, Richard said. Dr. Lamond held up 2 folding shovels and Rose understood. Hold on to something, Dr. Lamond said as he stood next to the emergency release button. There was a rush of air as he opened the outside vents. When they opened the airlock door, the smoke was almost too dense to see through, and it surrounded them, thick and brown. Dr. Lamond paced a 10-meter distance from the airlock, which was now a pale box covered in gray ash falling like snow. Flaming cinders bounced off his helmet as he dug a hole. He walked back to the airlock, paced another 10 meters, and dug another hole. In a few minutes, there were 4 holes on each side of the airlock. Now we dig a trench in a circle around the airlock, using the holes as guides, he said to Rose. Dig down about half a meter, and pile the dirt outside the ring. It was sweaty, difficult work in the biosuit. Rose tried not to look up, to gauge how close the fire was, keeping her head down and focused on the digging. Glowing embers dropped into the trench, on the growing berm of dirt, and on her biosuit. The heads-up display alerted her when larger cinders landed, but they were not hot enough or burned long enough to cause damage to the suit. Yet. "Rose, how's it going out there?" Richard's voice was taut with worry. She looked up. They were almost finished. She had 1 more meter to dig out, and Dr. Lamond was clearing out dried leaves and sticks that could ignite within their firebreak perimeter. "We're almost done," Rose puffed. The fire was terrifyingly close when they sealed the airlock door. Now all they could do was hope it worked. Chapter 9. Dr. Lamond sat on the floor, rebuilding the switch. Standing in front of the screen on the wall, Rose watched the fire's approach. So far, the fire had not crossed the berm. Soon smoke engulfed the camera, and it was impossible to see more. "How's it going?" Rose asked Dr. Lamond. "Another 20 minutes, I think," he answered. Rose sank to the floor near the airlock door, trying not to think about the fire, about dinosaurs that would happily eat her, or about being trapped in the Cretaceous and Kevin never knowing what happened to her. "Finished," Dr. Lamond said. Rose opened her eyes. She'd fallen asleep. The biosuit display told her the ambient temperature in the airlock was uncomfortably warm, but the fire had not breached the structure. Outside was still thick with smoke, but flames were no longer bearing down on them. She breathed a sigh of relief, and as she did, a drop of water landed on the lens. Then another, and another. It was finally raining. "I'm reinitializing the system," Dr. Lamond said. "Everything looks good here," Tanima responded. Rose closed her eyes as the air exchange cycle began. The unplanned nap was nice, but she needed a good night's sleep. "So much dirt and ash," Rose muttered as she peeled off her biosuit when the cycle was complete. "We're usually covered in something," Dr. Lamond laughed. He looked tired and pale, with dark circles under his eyes. He was relieved to be back in the base, but he knew he would soon have to face the consequences of his actions. When they opened the airlock door, Richard and Dr. Nilsson were waiting for them. "Sean!" Tanima exclaimed as she caught her colleague in a relieved hug. Richard looked like he wanted to hug Rose too, but restrained himself. "Are you doing okay?" he asked. Rose nodded. "Better now." "Any update on the temporal amplifier?" "Nothing yet." "I'll look at it. Maybe there's something we haven't tried." Rose began, but Richard was shaking his head. "You're going to eat a solid meal and get some sleep," he said with a lopsided grin. "No arguments, Your Majesty. The future will still be there when you wake." A good meal, a hot shower, and 8 hours of sleep later, Rose felt almost normal again, if a little sore. As she left the guest quarters, she heard Tanima exercising in the recreation room. Dr. Lamond was still resting, exhausted and dehydrated from his experience. The good news was that a medical scan declared him free of the toxin, as well as from Cretaceous-era bacteria, viruses, or other microscopic invaders. In the quiet of the night, the rain had quenched the fires. More good news. The computer monitor windows showed smoky steams and skeletal trees. But the sun was rising, and Rose knew the ecosystem would heal in time. After she breakfasted, Rose and Richard met in the computer tech room without Dr. Nilsson and Dr. Lamond. "I assume you ran a standard diagnostic," Rose said. "Yes, and reinitialized the system, and performed a temporal reset." "No dice," Richard answered. "Everything's working. It's like the TPC's just not there. And yet we still have access to the temporal mainframe and the database," Rose said, perplexed. "Have you scanned the timeline for any changes resulting from our activities at Yijon base?" "No, not yet," he murmured. "There wasn't a chance to do it privately until now." "We'd better do that first," Rose said. Richard could see the reluctance on her face. If the timeline had changed, if that was why they could not contact the TPC, they were in serious trouble. It was their responsibility as TPC agents to correct the error. and their options for correcting the timeline were not pleasant ones. He walked away from the temporal amplifier to look out the projection serving as a window while Rose programmed the scan. A breeze was pushing the smoke away, and the sky was a washed blue that reminded him of a summer day when he was a kid. "What are you doing?" Dr. Lamond asked. He was standing in the doorway, in his bathrobe, looking much better than he did the night before. "Analyzing why we can't reach the Temporal Protection Corps," Richard answered, stepping away from the view. "Any luck?" Richard exchanged looks with Rose. "Not yet. The equipment is functioning perfectly. We're not sure what the problem is." Dr. Lamond leaned against the door frame. "If memory serves, there's a protocol you agents have to follow, right? To be sure the timeline hasn't been altered." "That's true," Richard said. "And if you discover that we've damaged the timeline, you are required to fix it, right?" Rose looked up from the scan, her mouth firm. "Your information is accurate," she said. "We can't go back in time to stop the error before it happened, because that would form a new timeline. We would need to correct this timeline and not create multiple timelines." "And how would you do that?" Dr. Lamond asked in a soft voice. "It depends on what the error is," Richard said, his hackles rising. "And what if the error threatens human history?" Dr. Lamond took a step toward Richard and laughed. "Before humanity even exists." "What then?" "There's no reason to discuss it now," Rose answered, watching the monitor. "We aren't there yet." There was a long tone from the temporal amplifier. The scan was complete. "And," Dr. Lamond and Richard said at the same time. "And nothing," Rose grated. "There's nothing wrong. The timeline is unaltered. Everything is as it's supposed to be. We just can't reach the TPC." She turned away from the control panel and faced them. "I have no idea what to do next." "Can't we stay here until your mission is supposed to end?" Richard asked. "Someone from the TPC is scheduled to remove the base, right?" "It will take too long," Tanima shook her head. "There are not enough resources for the four of us. We could probably make the food and water last, but we'd run out of power and oxygen before they arrived." "There's got to be a way of sending the TPC a message," Shang said. Rose shook her head. "I tried everything I can think of." "Maybe we could try something else," Richard said. "Oh no," Rose muttered. She recognized the expression on Richard's face, the excited look in his eyes. "What's your idea?" Tanima asked. "Maybe we can leave a message that will be found in the future, like a time capsule," Richard suggested. "How would we do that?" "We can't leave anything behind," Rose started. "It would violate protocol. Anything left could damage the timeline." "No, I think he's on to something," Shang said. "What are you thinking?" Richard asked Shang. "We picked this location because key fossils were unearthed here in 2146. If we left a message where the fossils will be found, it would be found after time travel is discovered and the Temporal Protection Corps is established. The TPC could hold the message for 40 years or so, and then come get us when the time is right. There's no way we can assume the message will survive for 125 million years," Rose shook her head. "The Earth moves, animals and people change the landscape. Even if it wasn't against protocol, it would be a long shot at best." Tanima was smiling, her eyes shining. "Normally you'd be correct, but in this case, we can be certain the message will remain untouched." "How?" Rose asked, eyes narrowed. "In a couple of days, there will be a volcanic eruption," Shang answered. "It will cover much of the area with ash and pyroclastics. The eruption will trigger rain, and the water mixed with the volcanic material will create a sludge that will harden like cement. Like the fossils, it will protect our message over the eons." "A volcanic eruption," Richard murmured. "Great. This was your idea," Tanima teased. The three of them looked at Rose as she rubbed her face with her hands and then clasped them on the table, her eyes cast downward. On one hand, if we can't contact the TPC, we'll be stuck here with dwindling resources, unable to replenish our supplies without contaminating the biosphere, Rose said. On the other hand, we can violate protocol and plant an anachronistic object in an improper time frame in the hopes they can rescue us and that it won't damage the timeline. That about sums it up, Richard said. Sean crafted a time capsule using 2 vacuum-sealed containers designed for transporting samples back through time. The plan was to place the message in one container, which would be put in the second for added protection. Rose wrote the message to the TPC, addressing it to Agent Berg. Almost ready? Richard came into the kitchen as Rose was finishing the message. She held it up, showing him Agent Berg's name on the outside. Good idea, he said. She'll be at the TPC in 2146 and in 2189 when we go on this mission. Exactly, Rose said, cocking her head at him. Richard groaned and closed his eyes. That's why they sent us on this mission instead of more paleo-scientists, he said. She received the message from us 40 years ago. She knew we'd already been here. That's right, Rose said as she laughed. I'm finishing my career with a causality loop, clearly violating the law of temporal continuity. She grew serious and exhaled. Not exactly by the book. It was Richard and Tanima who placed the time capsule message in the caves on the other side of the mineral lake. 2 days later, from the safety of Yijan Base, they heard the eruption through the outside monitors and felt its tremors roll through the facility. It wasn't the largest eruption the Earth had ever produced, but it was still powerful and impressive. When the rain came, it had the effect of calming their nerves as well as cooling the land. Rose was sipping tea in the computer room when an automated voice broke the silence. Incoming shift. Rose stood up. Richard and Tanima appeared in the doorway together, and Shang arrived just as 2 figures emerged from a shimmering mirage tinged with red. Commander Sprucewood? A tall, elegant woman held out her hand to Rose. I'm Agent Farhana Vetta. This is Agent Corliss Allen. You got our message, Richard said. We got your message, Agent Vetta smiled. We don't know why the base's temporal amplifier isn't connecting with the TPC. Every test on our end shows nothing's wrong with the system. Nonetheless, we've brought a solution. Agent Vetta gestured to the case Agent Allen was carrying. As soon as Agent Allen sets up the portable unit, we can send you home. Chapter 10. Their shift back to the TPC returned them to the morning of the day after they left for the Cretaceous period. When medical personnel cleared them, Director Jeffries held a debriefing meeting in his office. Welcome back, the director said as Rose and Richard walked in. Thank you, Director, Rose said. It's good to be back, Richard said as he sat in the chair with the view. Agent Berg walked in a moment later, sitting in the chair under the window with a twinkle in her eye and the suggestion of a smirk. Okay, let's start from the beginning, Director Jeffries said as he closed the door. Rose and Richard covered every moment of their mission, from finding the illicitly obtained gel sample to the Battle of the Uranus and escaping the wildfire. There was a long silence when they finished. We don't know why you couldn't contact the TPC, nor why the base temporal amplifier malfunctioned. We didn't find anything wrong on our end or with the base's unit. Maybe it was sabotaged by the Chestnut Coven, Richard said, grinning. His face fell when he realized no one else was laughing. It was just a joke, he muttered. As you guessed, your message was found with a fossil dig and delivered to Agent Berg, Director Jeffries continued. The message was and continues to be confidential information. You're not to discuss it with anyone. We understand, Rose said. I'm glad the message idea worked, Richard said. Indeed, Agent Berg smiled. Will we be facing discipline for creating a causality loop? Rose asked. No, the director answered. But only because it was the safest way to maintain the timeline. I can't think of another circumstance where it would be acceptable, so don't make a habit of it, he said. Richard nodded. Like I'll ever find myself in a situation like that again, he thought. Have you learned anything about the mystery database analyses? Rose asked. Nothing yet, Director Jeffries answered. Remember, for us it's only been a day since you left. I expect a report this afternoon. Richard asked the question that had been bothering him since they returned. What will happen to Tanima and Shang? Dr. Nilsson will not face any sanctions. Dr. Lamond admits he violated protocol, exposing them to a toxin which resulted in a quarantine breach and endangered not only their lives but yours as well, Director Jeffries began. We have a science team on site now, scouring the area to remove fiber traces and spot-checking for modern microbial trespassers. What sanctions Dr. Lamond receives will depend on the team's report. He stood. It was clear he was not going to further discuss personnel issues with them. Congratulations on a job well done, he said, shaking their hands. See you at my retirement party, Agent Berg said to Richard with a grin. I'm looking forward to it, Richard said as they left the room. You are? Rose whispered to Richard as they walked down the stairs to the atrium. Why the change of heart? Oh well, Tanima, Dr. Nilsson invited me to go with her, Richard said, not looking at Rose. Rose glanced at him out of the corner of her eye, trying to hide her smile. Good, she said almost inaudibly. When they reached the atrium, Rose excused herself to return to her lab to prepare for her last mission. Richard stayed in the atrium and ordered a coffee just before the cafe staff went home for the afternoon. Sitting at the table behind the plants, he watched the light fade as the sun set, lost in thoughts of the Cretaceous period. Are you sure this will work? A voice hissed, startling Richard out of his reverie. Yes, another voice whispered in reply. When she uses Unit 6, it will malfunction and all our problems will be solved. Richard froze, waiting to hear more, but nothing more was said. He stood and walked around the plants. No one was there. He was alone in the atrium. Maybe he misunderstood. Maybe he was dreaming. He tried to think rationally about what he heard, but nothing he came up with eliminated the uncomfortable pit in his stomach. Something bad was going to happen. Not knowing why, he headed for Rose's lab. Can I help you? Rose's mentee, Jonas Fernley, was the only one there when Richard burst through the door. Is Rose here? No, Commander Sprucewood is finalizing her last mission. Her last mission, Richard muttered. You know, the one where she'll confirm with her future self in the 20th century that her marriage to Kevin won't cause any issues in the timeline. Right. When is she going on that mission? Jonas picked up a computer tablet and read aloud from it. She's scheduled to shift in about an hour. Agent Hall Unit 6. The pit in Richard's stomach exploded into churning acid. He grabbed a piece of paper from Rose's desk, writing furiously. Give this to her as soon as she gets back, do you understand? He shoved the folded paper into Jonas's hands. Jonas nodded, staring as Richard rushed out of the room. Rose returned to the lab 10 minutes after Richard left. Okay, Jonas, it's all set, she said. Next stop, 1945. Commander Sprucewood, Agent Kern was here a short while ago, Jonas said. His face was paler than usual. He asked me to give you this. Rose took the note from Jonas and read it to herself. Unicorns are from legend. Night is when stars come out. Ilex has red berries. Thanks for everything. Soap bubbles are pretty. Animals can be dangerous. Boots must be comfortable. Orange doesn't rhyme with anything. Tulips grow in the spring. Axes chop wood. Give presents for birthdays. Ebony can be shiny. Donuts are tasty. She inhaled sharply. It was a message in code, like she had taught him. Unit sabotaged, it said. She reached for her computer when the wail of an alarm echoed through her lab, followed by a system-wide announcement. Emergency alert. Medical teams to the agent hall immediately. Code red. This is not a drill. The blood left Rose's face. She put the note in her pocket. Jonas, contact Dr. Tanima Nilsson. She's a paleobiologist in the sciences department. Have her meet me in the atrium. The medical team was already running with a stretcher when Rose arrived at the atrium. She saw Richard's unconscious face before they rushed him to the medical wing. What happened? She demanded of Agent Veta, who followed the medical team out of the agent hall. We're not sure, Agent Veta said, concern etched on her face. A unit malfunctioned. Agent Kern was injured. Injured how? I don't know, it appears serious. Rose pressed her lips together. Thank you. Of course, Commander Sprucewood, Agent Veta responded, her eyes filled with sympathy. Rose turned. Tanima was standing behind her. The medical staff would not let them see Richard, and it was an hour before a doctor joined them in a private waiting area. He's resting now, the doctor said. It appears he was caught in some kind of temporal wave. He's suffering from hallucinations, paranoia. We had to sedate him. Dr. Jean Lamonde is a patient here, under observation after exposure to a biological toxin, Tanima said. Are you aware of his case? The doctor nodded. Yes, I'm his physician. Agent Kern might have been exposed to the same toxin, Rose said, but the doctor was already shaking her head. We've already ruled that out, she said. She paused. We think we're looking at temporal aberration disorder. The doctor stood, ignoring Rose's intake of breath. You can see him now. Richard's eyes were closed. His breathing was regular, but he did not look restful. His hands and feet twitched, and the muscles in his face were tense. Sean joined them a few moments later. They just released me, he said. I heard the news as I was signing out. He'll need to be watched round the clock, the doctor said. I'll stay, Sean said. I owe him. If you guys hadn't found me, I'd probably be dead. I need to see the director, Rose said. I'll take over for you later. Agent Berg's retirement party was a quiet event. There had been talk of canceling it in the aftermath of Richard's accident, but the director was adamant that Agent Berg's decades of service to the TPC be recognized and celebrated. Temporal engineers had gone over every millimeter of Unit 6 and found no evidence of sabotage or malfunction. Rose had not accepted that result and badgered Director Jeffries to take all the temporal amplifier units offline. She showed Richard's coded message to Agent Berg, and her voice added to Rose's help to convince him. But after bringing TPC operations to a halt for hours, all the units were determined to be in perfect order, and time traveling resumed. Now Rose stood in the back of the large hall behind the atrium, which the TPC used for large gatherings. Standing near the door, she considered slipping out of the party unnoticed to go sit with Richard. She was certain Agent Berg would understand. Commander Sprucewood? Tanima was standing in the doorway. She'd not attended the party and seemed relieved to find Rose so close to the entrance. Hello, Dr. Nilsson. What can I do for you? I brought you something, she said as she held up a long, narrow package. Rose followed her into the quiet passage to the atrium and opened the wrapping. Inside was a long feather, red at the base, tapering to a bright orange at the end. It's a Uranus feather, Tanima said. I thought you might like it, you know, as a memento of our adventures. It's wonderful, Rose said. Thank you. Thank you for everything you did for us, Tanima said. Rose gently laid the precious feather back in the package. Not at all, Dr. Nilsson, she responded. Tanima put her hand on Rose's arm and Rose looked up in surprise. Please. Call me Tanima. Rose smiled, the first time she'd smiled in days, and squeezed Tanima's hand with her own. Thank you, Tanima. Tanima turned to leave. Wait, Rose said suddenly. When you reprogrammed the airlock's hologram lenses so Dr. Lamond and I could find it, did you leave the base to do that? No, Tanima answered with a smile. I was able to do that from the computer room. And Agent Kern was with you, right? He didn't leave the base? No, of course not. What's this all about? Nothing, Rose said. I guess I was mistaken. Rose refused any kind of farewell party for herself, requesting that she be allowed to leave the TPC quietly. She'd said her goodbyes to an unconscious Richard in the medical wing, leaving him in Tanima's care. And while she arrived the next morning, before most TPC staff had reported in for the day, she was not surprised to find Astrid Berg waiting for her. Agent Berg, Rose said. Astrid. I'm retired now, remember? But available to be recalled at need, isn't that what Director Jeffries said? That's true. Is that why you're here? Have you been recalled already? Not officially, Astrid smiled. I'm afraid I'm the bearer of bad news. Rose's heart dropped into her stomach. Agent Kern has disappeared. She realized she was trembling. She'd calmly run from dinosaurs and wildfire, but now she was shaking. How? Rose took a deep breath. They didn't know how Richard escaped the medical wing, Agent Berg explained. Tanima had been sitting with him, and the last thing she remembered was Richard smiling at her, holding her hand. Her next memory was of being awakened by the medic. Her blood sample tested positive for the same sedative administered to Richard. Someone could have injected Tanima from behind and then kidnapped Richard, Rose asserted. It's possible but unlikely, Agent Berg said. None of the videos show any unauthorized personnel or Agent Kern being removed. It's more likely that in his paranoid state, he somehow got a hold of an injector, sedated Dr. Nilsson, and left on his own. Rose sat in a chair, her head bowed. There's more, I'm afraid, Agent Berg said gently. There's a record of a shift from Unit 6. It could only have been Agent Kern. Do we know when he shifted to? Agent Berg shook her head. It was far into the past, that's all we can tell. What about the rescue mission? Rose asked, looking up, her eyes red. Who's leading that? Director Jeffries has closed the investigation. But, Rose started, and Agent Berg stopped her with a look. We don't know where he is. There's no sign of him in history. We don't know when to go to find him. Rose looked at the ceiling, blinking rapidly. It was kind of you to tell me, Astrid, Rose said thickly. I also came to wish you congratulations on your marriage, and to give you this. Agent Berg held up a case. That looks like a portable temporal amplifier unit, yes. No agent in the TPC has a temporal amplifier for their personal use, Rose said. Astrid set the case down on the desk. In this case, we've made an exception. In case we need to recall you, Astrid smiled, her eyes kind. She put her hand on the case, her usual stern expression returning. You understand, you may not use this unless approved by the TPC, not even to contact the TPC without authorization. Rose felt as if a great weight was suddenly lifted from her shoulders. She nodded. I understand. Good. You are authorized to use this unit for your last mission and send a report on the outcome at your discretion. Thank you, Astrid. Rose picked up the case as former Agent Berg turned to leave. You believe it was sabotage, don't you? Rose said. It wasn't a question. The mainframe analysis requests, the failure of the Yi-John-based temporal amplifier, Richard's injury and disappearance. It's all connected, isn't it? Astrid Berg held out her hand, and warmth flooded Rose as she took it. Good luck, Commander Sprucewood. She paused. Keep your eyes open. Epilogue. Rose and Kevin went on to live happy, fulfilling lives. They had 2 children, Pierce and Willow, and 3 grandchildren, Holly, Scott, and Sharon. After many years of marital bliss, Rose and Kevin died. By this time Pierce was living in Scotland, and Willow had developed a mysterious illness that left her unable to recognize reality. Holly was pregnant with Kevin and Rose's first great-grandchild, and Scott was relocating to a new job on the other side of the continent. That left youngest granddaughter, Sharon, the job of managing her grandparents' estate. She put their house up for sale and was clearing out all their belongings when she stumbled across a mysterious message. Then her world turned upside down. The story continues in biding time, The Chestnut Coven. Learn more at https://linktr.ee/e.w.barnes.